Samuel Little was born on June 7, 1940, in Reynolds, Georgia, during a period of deep poverty and racial segregation in the American South. His early years were marked by instability, hardship, and a sense of abandonment that would shape the man he would later become. Unlike many serial killers who grow up in relatively stable households before developing their darker impulses, Sam Little's life began in turmoil. He claimed that his mother was a prostitute who neglected him, leaving him to be raised largely by his grandmother in Lorain, Ohio. Whether every detail he told was true remains uncertain, but what is clear is that his childhood was deeply unstable and lacking the foundations of love, support, and stability that most children need to thrive. Growing up in the 1940s and 1950s as a young African-American boy in Ohio, Sam faced multiple layers of difficulty. His family circumstances made him feel unwanted, while the broader environment of racism and social inequality only reinforced his sense of being an outsider. Teachers described him as a troubled student, one who struggled to pay attention, often acted out, and seemed disinterested in learning. By his teenage years, Little was already showing signs of behavioral problems, skipping school, fighting with classmates, and stealing small items. His school records painted a bleak picture. He was a child drifting toward delinquency, without the guidance of stable parents or mentors. Psychologists often look at early warning signs in the lives of serial killers, pointing to patterns of neglect, abuse, or social rejection. In Sam Little's case, neglect was perhaps the strongest factor. He later admitted that he never truly knew what it was like to feel loved or protected. Instead, he grew up feeling invisible, unwanted, and angry. That sense of invisibility would later carry into his choice of victims, women who lived on the margins of society, women whom he believed no one would miss. But in these early years, that dark pattern was only beginning to take shape. As a teenager, Sam began to channel some of his energy into athletics. Despite his troubles in school, he was physically gifted. He developed a fascination with boxing, spending time in gyms and training himself in the basics of the sport. He was tall, strong, and quick, with the physical build of a natural fighter. Boxing gave him a sense of power and control that he lacked elsewhere in life. Yet it also exposed him to environments where violence was normalized, where fists, aggression, and intimidation were seen as pathways to respect. For Sam, the boxing ring became both an escape from his troubled world and a foundation for the violence he would later inflict on his victims. But Sam's life outside the ring was far from disciplined. By the late 1950s, he had already begun accumulating a criminal record. Petty thefts, shoplifting, and break-ins landed him in trouble with the law multiple times. He dropped out of school early and spent much of his time drifting between states, hitchhiking, and searching for purpose. Each arrest seemed only to reinforce his outsider status, teaching him that society saw him as a criminal long before he would become one of history's most prolific killers. The justice system gave him brief encounters with discipline, short jail stays, court appearances, but never long enough to reform him. Instead, each encounter taught him how to survive as a drifter, how to slip through cracks, and how to avoid the full consequences of his actions. His grandmother, who had raised him, tried to guide him, but Sam was already heading down a dark path. Without stable parental figures, he sought belonging in the streets. He drifted through towns, often sleeping in abandoned buildings or cheap motels, stealing food or money when necessary. By the time he was 20, he had no fixed home, no job, and no long-term goals. What he did have was an increasing familiarity with violence and a growing tendency to use it to assert control. Psychiatrists who later studied Sam Little argued that his childhood environment, marked by neglect, instability, and lack of nurturing relationships, likely contributed to his inability to form empathy. From a young age, he learned that people came and went, that love was conditional, and that survival often required manipulation or aggression. These lessons would later define his approach to victims. He saw them not as human beings, but as disposable objects in a world that had long treated him as disposable too. It's important to understand that Sam Little's beginnings were not those of a master criminal plotting his future. Instead, they were the beginnings of a boy who never truly found a place in society, who never learned compassion, and who sought power in the only ways he knew, through fighting, stealing, and drifting. His story in the 1940s and 1950s was not yet one of murder, but the foundation was being laid. The neglect, the boxing, the petty crime, all of it was shaping the man who would eventually become the deadliest serial killer in American history. By the end of the 1950s, Sam Little was already living outside of society's rules. He was no longer a child, but not yet a fully formed adult. His adolescence had been consumed by instability and crime, leaving him with little chance of building a stable life. The seeds of violence had been planted, though no one at the time could imagine just how many lives he would one day take. He was a drifter in the making, already used to moving from town to town, already building the habits that would allow him to kill for decades without being caught. Sam Little's childhood was the story of neglect, broken family ties, and a young man slipping through the cracks of society. It was not a story of love or guidance. It was a story of survival. And survival for Sam meant doing whatever he wanted with little thought for consequences. Those lessons of childhood, control, invisibility, and power, would define the next phase of his life as he moved into adulthood, boxing, and an expanding world of crime. As the 1960s began, Sam Little entered adulthood with little more than a restless spirit and a body built for fighting. He was now a young man in his early 20s, hardened by a childhood of neglect, poverty, and crime. But despite his troubled past, he harbored ambitions, dreams of making something of himself through boxing, the one discipline that seemed to give him a sense of purpose. The boxing ring, unlike the rest of his chaotic world, had rules, structure, and a way to channel his aggression into something productive. It was, for a time, the closest thing he had to direction. Standing over 6 feet tall and weighing around 200 pounds, Sam had the physique and raw strength that made him a natural athlete. He began frequenting gyms, often sleeping in them or hanging around until he could convince someone to let him spar. To those who watched him fight, it was clear he had talent. His punches carried weight, his reflexes were quick, and his endurance was strong. But he lacked discipline. Trainers noticed his tendency to lose focus, his reluctance to follow structured routines, and his habit of disappearing for days at a time. For Sam, boxing was less about discipline and more about the thrill of testing his power, the thrill of winning, and the thrill of domination. During this decade, Sam lived as a drifter. He had no stable job, no permanent address, and no long-term relationships. He traveled across states, often by bus, train, or hitchhiking, surviving through theft, odd jobs, and sometimes by charming strangers who offered him temporary shelter. He would spend weeks in one city, working out in local gyms, sometimes even entering amateur boxing matches before moving on to the next. It was a lifestyle of freedom, but also of constant instability. He was unmoored, unattached, and unaccountable, a man living in the shadows of society. But Sam's drifting life was not only about chasing his boxing dreams. It was also about crime. Throughout the 1960s, he accumulated a growing criminal record. Arrests for shoplifting, fraud, and burglary became frequent. Each arrest was usually followed by a short jail stay or probation, never long enough to keep him off the streets permanently. Law enforcement knew him as a troublemaker, but not yet as a violent predator. He was, at this stage, a petty criminal with potential, either to reform or to spiral deeper into crime. Unfortunately, Sam chose the latter path. His encounters with women during these years also revealed early patterns of behavior that would later define his crimes. He preferred the company of women who lived on society's margins. Prostitutes, drug users, and women struggling with poverty or addiction. These women, often unseen by mainstream society, were drawn to Sam's physical presence and his ability to project charm when he wanted to. He could be funny, charismatic, even gentle at first. But beneath that exterior was a man who craved control. His relationships, fleeting as they were, often turned volatile. Violence was never far beneath the surface, and Sam discovered that he derived a sense of power and satisfaction from dominating women physically and psychologically. Despite his violent tendencies, Sam's boxing skills gave him a sense of identity that kept him going through the 1960s. He fought in amateur matches, sometimes under different names, sometimes earning a little money, though never enough to build a career. He lacked the discipline to stay committed, often disappearing from the sport for weeks or months before returning. For him, boxing was less about climbing a ladder of success and more about sustaining his drifting lifestyle. It gave him an excuse to travel, a reason to show up in new towns, and a way to mask the darker urges growing inside him. The 1960s were also a period when Sam honed his survival skills. He learned how to manipulate people, how to gain their trust, and how to avoid detection. He became adept at reading others, knowing who he could exploit and when to disappear. This was the decade in which he perfected the art of being invisible in plain sight. He was the tall, quiet drifter who passed through town, sometimes remembered as a boxer, sometimes as a thief, but never as a serious threat. He was just another face in the crowd, and that anonymity would later allow him to kill without attracting attention. Sam's criminal record during the 1960s spanned multiple states. He was arrested in Ohio, Florida, and even on the West Coast. Police reports described him as transient, a man with no fixed residence, no stable employment, and a history of theft. He was often released quickly, his crimes considered minor compared to others. But those who encountered him often remembered his presence. He was imposing, with a stare that seemed to linger too long, and a physicality that made people uneasy. He carried himself like a fighter, calm, confident, and ready to strike if provoked. As the 1960s drew to a close, Sam Little was nearing 30 years old. He was no closer to a boxing career, no closer to stability, and no closer to reform. His life was a patchwork of short, lived opportunities, failed attempts at structure, and endless drifting. The seeds of his violent future were firmly planted. His preference for vulnerable women, his fascination with power, and his lack of empathy were becoming clearer, while the world around him entered an era of cultural change. Civil rights movements, social revolutions, and shifting norms. Sam remained on the outside, a man shaped by neglect, drifting through life without purpose, guided only by his impulses. In hindsight, the 1960s represented the last chance for Sam Little to choose a different path. Had he committed to boxing, found stable mentorship, or sought a different environment, perhaps his story would have been different. But instead, he embraced the life of a drifter, a thief, and a man already comfortable with violence. His boxing gloves offered him a way to sharpen his strength, but they also symbolized the violence that was becoming central to his identity. By the end of this decade, Sam Little was no longer just a troubled youth. He was a man set in his ways, restless, nomadic, and dangerous. His ambitions of becoming a boxer were fading, replaced by a life defined by crime and control. The next phase of his life, in the 1970s, would mark his transition from a petty criminal and drifter into something far darker, a predator who would begin taking lives in the shadows of America's cities. By the late 1960s, Sam Little's drifting lifestyle had fully taken root. He was no longer a young man searching for direction, but rather a career drifter living day to day, town to town, with little thought of the future. What he did think about was survival, and for Sam, survival often meant breaking the law. His early brushes with police in the 1960s for petty theft and burglary had already marked him as a small-time criminal. But as the 1970s approached, his crimes began to escalate in seriousness, reflecting both his growing confidence and his deepening disregard for rules, authority, and human life. Sam's criminal record began to grow rapidly during this period. Arrests for shoplifting, fraud, assault, and theft became common. He moved frequently across state lines, making it difficult for authorities to track him consistently. He had no stable job and no ties to any single community. He was the kind of man who could appear in a town one week and vanish the next without leaving a trace. This transience not only allowed him to evade law enforcement, but also foreshadowed the predatory pattern he would use later in life to kill dozens of women across the country without immediate suspicion. One of the earliest notable crimes in Sam's record involved breaking into a store to steal goods. Caught and arrested, he was sentenced to short jail time. But he quickly returned to the streets after serving it. His sentences were never long enough to stop his behavior, and in some cases, he avoided prison altogether through plea deals or probation. The justice system treated him as a nuisance rather than a serious threat. At that stage, there was little reason for authorities to think otherwise. He was just another drifter, one of many men swept into America's growing prison system during the 1960s and 70s. But underneath his record of thefts and burglaries, a darker pattern was beginning to emerge. Sam had developed an obsession with women, particularly those living on the margins of society. Prostitutes, drug addicts, and women struggling with poverty became his targets, not yet as murder victims, but as individuals he could intimidate, assault, and control. Police reports from this period describe incidents of assault and attempted rape, though many charges were either reduced or dismissed due to lack of evidence. The women he targeted often had little credibility in the eyes of the law. They were not believed, or they were too frightened to testify, allowing Sam to escape serious punishment. Each time he slipped free of consequences, his confidence grew. In the early 1970s, Sam moved frequently between Ohio, Florida, and California. He lived out of cheap motels, abandoned houses, and sometimes in his car. He supported himself through theft, shoplifting, and odd jobs. But wherever he went, crimes followed. He would be arrested in one state, serve a brief sentence, and then reappear in another. Law enforcement agencies had little ability at the time to coordinate across state lines. There was no centralized system to track a transient criminal like Sam Little. This lack of coordination allowed him to build a criminal record that spanned the country, yet never added up to the full picture of who he was becoming. By 1975, Sam had been arrested dozens of times for theft and assault. He was already known to police in multiple jurisdictions, but never as anything more than a drifter with sticky fingers and a temper. Yet behind the scenes, Sam was refining his methods of control. He was learning how to lure women into vulnerable positions, how to overpower them with his strength, and how to silence them when they resisted. These lessons, practiced through assaults and attempted rapes, would later translate into murder. He discovered that he enjoyed the feeling of power, the rush of holding someone's life in his hands, and the certainty that society did not care enough about these women to protect them. In 1976, Sam was arrested in Missouri on charges of assaulting a woman. The victim claimed that he had beaten and attempted to strangle her, but the case collapsed in court. As in many of his early arrests, the victim's credibility was attacked and Sam walked free. This became a recurring theme in his life. He would be accused of violent crimes against women, yet time and again he managed to escape serious punishment. His victims were often poor, addicted, or working as prostitutes, individuals whose voices carried little weight in the justice system of the 1970s. Sam recognized this weakness, and he exploited it. He knew he could target women on the margins of society, and that, more often than not, the law would fail to protect them. The 1970s were also the years when Sam began to experiment with killing. Later in life, during his confessions, he admitted that his first murder took place around 1970. He claimed that he strangled a woman in Miami after an encounter turned violent. If true, this would mean that Sam Little had begun his killing spree decades before anyone suspected. For years, he kept this secret, continuing to drift, continuing to kill, and continuing to avoid detection. Authorities at the time had no idea that the drifter they kept arresting for petty crimes was also leaving a trail of bodies across the country. Sam's use of strangulation as a method of killing was significant. It reflected both his physical strength and his desire for control. Unlike a gun or knife, strangulation required close contact. It allowed him to feel the life leaving his victims' bodies. It was intimate, personal, and in his mind, satisfying. He later admitted that he chose this method because it gave him a sense of godlike power, and because strangulation often left few visible injuries. Medical examiners in the 1970s frequently misclassified his murders as drug overdoses, accidents, or natural causes. This misclassification allowed him to keep killing undetected for decades. By the end of the 1970s, Sam Little had already left behind victims across multiple states, though no one yet realized it. His official record still described him as a drifter, thief, and occasional violent offender, but never as a serial killer. The system saw him as a repeat petty criminal, not as the man who would eventually be labeled the most prolific serial killer in American history. He had perfected the art of living invisibly, drifting in and out of towns, avoiding long-term consequences, and targeting those society ignored. The 1970s were a turning point in Sam Little's life. What began as petty theft and drifting had evolved into violence, assault, and murder. He was no longer simply surviving on the margins. He was actively preying on them. Each arrest that ended in release only emboldened him further. He learned that the system was not designed to catch someone like him, and he used that knowledge to expand his hunting grounds. For Sam Little, the 1970s were the decade when he truly crossed the line from troubled drifter to predator, setting the stage for the decades of killing that would follow. By the dawn of the 1980s, Sam Little was no longer just a petty thief with a long list of arrests. He had become something far darker, a predator who had learned how to exploit his invisibility as a drifter to hunt, kill, and escape detection. The years between the late 1970s and 1980s would mark the transformation of Sam's life into a constant cycle of drifting, violence, and murder. It was in these decades that his crimes escalated to a scale that few could imagine, leaving behind dozens of victims scattered across America, most of them forgotten by the system that failed to protect them. Sam's life had no anchor. He had no stable job, no permanent home, no lasting relationships. He moved across the country with ease, hitchhiking, driving stolen cars, or riding buses. He lived in cheap motels, abandoned houses, or in his car when he had one. He often stole to get by. Clothes, food, money, whatever he could. He was, in every sense, a drifter, and that lifestyle gave him both cover and opportunity. Because he never stayed in one place long enough, police could not connect his crimes. One week he might be in Florida, the next in California, and then in Ohio. To those who encountered him, he was just a passing stranger, someone who came and went without leaving a mark. But in reality, Sam was leaving many marks. He just chose victims whose society often overlooked. His choice of victims was deliberate. He targeted women who lived on the margins. Sex workers, drug addicts, women struggling with homelessness or poverty. These women were vulnerable, easy to lure, and less likely to be reported missing. Many of them had little contact with family, and when they disappeared, police often dismissed their cases as runaways, overdoses, or accidents. Sam understood this and he used it to his advantage. He later admitted that he chose these women because he believed no one would care if they were gone. And tragically, for years, he was right. The method of killing that Sam perfected during this period was strangulation. Unlike other methods of murder, strangulation required physical dominance, something Sam had plenty of. At over 6 feet tall with the build of a boxer, he could easily overpower most of his victims. Strangulation also left few obvious signs of homicide. Many of Sam's victims were initially misclassified by medical examiners as overdoses or deaths by natural causes, particularly when drugs or alcohol were present in their system. This allowed him to keep killing without raising alarms. Each misclassified death was another cover, another chance for him to continue. Sam's pattern became chillingly consistent. He would often approach women late at night, usually in areas known for sex work or drug activity. He would lure them into his car, sometimes with the promise of drugs, alcohol, or money. Once they were isolated, he would strike, attacking with sudden violence, overpowering them, and strangling them until they stopped breathing. When he was finished, he would dump their bodies in remote areas, alleyways, or abandoned lots. Because his victims were often people whom society already ignored, their deaths went unnoticed or uninvestigated. For Sam, this invisibility was his greatest weapon. Throughout the 1980s, Sam's killings spanned across multiple states. He admitted later to murders in places like Los Angeles, Miami, and Cleveland, among many others. Each city became a hunting ground, each stop on his drifting journey another opportunity to satisfy his violent urges. The exact number of women he killed during this decade remains uncertain, but FBI investigators believe it was dozens. Some estimates suggest that by the end of the 1980s, Sam had already killed more than 50 women. Yet, incredibly, he continued to evade capture for murder. Police in different states had pieces of the puzzle, but without a way to connect them, Sam remained free. But Sam wasn't just killing during this time. He continued his life of petty crime as well, often getting arrested for theft, assault, or drug-related charges. His criminal record grew longer with each passing year, but the arrests never connected him to the trail of bodies he was leaving behind. For law enforcement, he was still just a drifter with a history of minor violence and theft, not a serial killer. The system had no way of recognizing the scale of his crimes. Each arrest, each short prison stay, was simply another pause in his killing spree, not an end to it. One of the reasons Sam was able to continue for so long was his ability to blend in. Despite his violent tendencies, he could be charming when he wanted to. He had a way of convincing people that he was harmless, even kind. He could joke, tell stories, and make others feel at ease. Many of his victims likely trusted him in those first moments, believing they were safe with him. This ability to mask his true nature made him even more dangerous. To strangers, he was just another wandering man with a past in boxing. To his victims, he was death itself. The escalation of his violence during this period also revealed something about his psychology. For Sam, the killings were not just about sex or money. They were about control. He admitted in later interviews that he enjoyed the act of strangulation, the feeling of holding someone's life in his hands. It gave him a sense of power he never had in his own life. As a neglected child, a failed boxer, and a lifelong drifter, Sam had little control over his circumstances. But with his victims, he was in complete command. That intoxicating sense of power drove him to kill again and again, feeding an addiction that would last for decades. By the end of the 1980s, Sam Little had firmly established his pattern. He was a drifter, a predator, and a killer operating in plain sight. He had murdered dozens of women across the country, leaving behind a trail of victims whose deaths were largely ignored. Law enforcement had crossed paths with him countless times, but always for lesser crimes. He had perfected the art of surviving on the margins. Just visible enough to be recognized as a petty criminal, but invisible enough to hide his true nature as a serial killer. The 1970s and 1980s were the years in which Sam Little transformed into America's most prolific killer, though no one yet realized the full scope of what he had done. It would take decades, new investigative techniques, and eventually Sam's own confessions before the truth would come to light. But in the 1980s, Sam Little was still free, still drifting, and still killing, moving from one town to another like a shadow. Each new city brought fresh opportunity, each vulnerable woman another target. His violence had escalated beyond return, and the country remained unaware that the most prolific serial killer in American history was moving among them unseen. By the time the 1980s turned into the 1990s, Sam Little had already killed far more women than anyone suspected. His crimes stretched across decades, states, and countless cities, leaving behind a trail of bodies that law enforcement largely failed to connect. These years, spanning the late 1980s and throughout the 1990s, were a period when his murders multiplied and his pattern became even clearer, though at the time few investigators saw the full picture. He was a ghostly figure, drifting in and out of communities, preying on the vulnerable, and disappearing before anyone realized what had happened. The choice of victims during this period was deliberate and chillingly consistent. Sam targeted women who lived on society's margins, sex workers, addicts, homeless women, and those struggling with mental health or poverty. These women were often ignored, dismissed, or stigmatized, and their disappearances rarely generated headlines. Many had complicated personal histories that made them less likely to be believed by authorities. For Sam, this meant protection. He admitted later that he specifically chose these women because he knew their cases would not be prioritized. In his own words, he selected women whom nobody was going to miss. The FBI would later uncover that Sam's victim count during the 1980s and 1990s alone could have been more than 60, though the exact number may never be known. Many of the cases remained unsolved for years, classified as overdoses, accidents, or unexplained deaths. Coroners often failed to recognize the signs of strangulation especially when drugs or alcohol were present in the body. Forensic science in the 1980s was not as advanced as it is today, and Sam used that to his advantage. He left little evidence, no obvious murder weapons, and few witnesses. He relied on brute strength and careful disposal of bodies in isolated places, confident that the deaths would not be traced back to him. Sam's movements during this period were widespread. He traveled across Florida, California, Texas, Ohio, Louisiana, and beyond. Each new city became a hunting ground. He had no fixed home, no employer to tie him down, and no family expecting him to stay in one place. This constant movement made him almost impossible to track. Local police departments often lacked the resources or communication to connect murders across state lines. A woman found strangled in Los Angeles bore no obvious connection to a similar case in Miami. To law enforcement, they looked like isolated tragedies, not the work of a single, relentless killer. What is most haunting about Sam Little's crimes during these years is how invisible his victims became. Many of the women he killed were buried without names, their bodies left unidentified for years. Some families never knew what happened to their daughters, sisters, or mothers. In many cases, no one even reported them missing. Sam understood this tragic reality and built his killing strategy around it. He exploited society's indifference to marginalized women, and it allowed him to kill with near impunity. He later described in interviews how he remembered every detail of these murders. He could recall the faces, the clothes, the locations, even decades after the crimes. His memory for the killings was uncanny, almost photographic. Yet he admitted that he felt no remorse. For him, these women were not people, they were objects of control, moments of satisfaction, and forgotten lives that reinforced his sense of power. He told investigators that the act of strangulation gave him a kind of pleasure that nothing else in his life had offered. Each murder was not an accident or a crime of passion. It was a deliberate choice, repeated again and again. While Sam's killing spree continued, his official criminal record grew with arrests for unrelated crimes: shoplifting, theft, drug possession, and assault. He spent short stints in jail, but never long enough to stop his pattern of murder. In fact, these arrests sometimes acted as pauses, breaks between killings, before he returned to the streets to continue his predation. The justice system repeatedly failed to recognize the true threat he posed, treating him as a nuisance rather than a predator. Each release put him back into society, free to continue his hunt. By the mid-1990s, investigators in different cities began to notice similarities in certain cases: women found strangled, often with drug histories, left in secluded places. But without DNA evidence, centralized databases, or communication between departments, these connections rarely went beyond speculation. The idea of a single killer operating nationwide seemed implausible. Serial killers were thought to stay within certain regions or display patterns that were easier to identify. Sam Little broke that mold. His transient lifestyle, his choice of marginalized victims, and his method of killing made him nearly undetectable. For the families of his victims, the 1980s and 1990s were decades of unanswered questions. Many searched for loved ones who simply vanished, never knowing they had crossed paths with one of the most prolific killers in history. Others were told by authorities that their loved ones had likely overdosed or run away, dismissing the possibility of foul play. This dismissive attitude only deepened the invisibility of Sam's victims, compounding the pain of families who deserved answers but were given none. In his later years, Sam would confess to many of the murders he committed during this period, drawing detailed sketches of his victims to help identify them. He recalled specific encounters in cities like Miami, Los Angeles, and New Orleans, describing how he picked up women, charmed them, and then took their lives. His memories of these decades were disturbingly vivid, almost as if he relived the crimes in his mind. For him, these murders were not forgotten. They were trophies etched permanently into his memory. The unsolved murders of the 1980s and 1990s represented the height of Sam Little's killing career. He had perfected his method, identified his targets, and mastered the art of evasion. Law enforcement remained blind to the scope of his crimes, hampered by limited resources, weak communication, and societal indifference to his victims. Sam, meanwhile, continued to drift, confident that he was untouchable. By the end of the 1990s, Sam Little had already killed more women than almost any serial killer in American history. Yet, incredibly, he was still free, still moving from town to town, and still taking lives in the shadows. The pattern of his victims was clear only in hindsight. Women forgotten by society, killed in silence, their stories erased. For 2 decades, he operated as one of the most dangerous predators in America, hidden behind the mask of a drifter, a thief, and a boxer who never found success. It would take another decade, advances in DNA technology, and the persistence of investigators to finally connect the dots. But during the 1980s and 1990s, Sam Little thrived in the gaps of the justice system, feeding his compulsion and leaving behind a legacy of unsolved murders that haunted families and investigators alike. He was, during these years, a killer in plain sight, unnoticed, underestimated, and unmatched in his brutality. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, Sam Little's name appeared in countless police reports and arrest records. Yet, despite dozens of encounters with law enforcement, he remained free to continue his crimes. His ability to slip through the cracks of the justice system was not only the result of his transient lifestyle, but also a reflection of systemic failures, disbelieved victims' unconnected cases, and a lack of investigative resources. These decades would prove that Sam was not just a killer. He was also a master at surviving within the blind spots of law enforcement. Sam's rap sheet during this period was extensive. By the early 1980s, he had been arrested more than 50 times across multiple states for charges ranging from theft to assault to fraud. Each time, the charges were minor enough, or the evidence thin enough, that he avoided long prison sentences. At most, he would serve short stints behind bars before returning to the streets. The system saw him as a career petty criminal, a nuisance who floated between states, but not as a threat of any larger scale. What investigators failed to see was that these petty crimes were a mask covering a killing spree of historic proportions. One of the earliest serious encounters came in 1984 in San Diego, California. Sam was arrested for the assault and attempted strangulation of 2 women. Both women survived the attacks, and their testimony led to his conviction. For this, Sam served time in prison, though not nearly as long as one might expect. After less than 3 years, he was released back into society. This was one of the first times authorities came close to recognizing the violent predator beneath his drifter persona, but the sentence was too short, the lesson unlearned. Instead of rehabilitation, prison became a pause in his killing spree, a temporary interruption rather than a permanent end. Following his release, Sam resumed his drifting lifestyle almost immediately. He moved to Los Angeles, where he blended into the vast urban sprawl. In a city where thousands of people disappeared into the shadows every year, Sam found an ideal hunting ground. During the late 1980s, women began to turn up dead in alleyways, vacant lots, and abandoned buildings, many of them sex workers or drug addicts. Though patterns were noticed, Los Angeles at the time was plagued with multiple serial killers and violent crime waves. Detectives struggled to keep up, and Sam's murders blended into the chaos. He was questioned in connection with some deaths, but nothing stuck. He remained free. In the 1990s, his record continued to grow. He was arrested again and again, sometimes for drug possession, sometimes for shoplifting, and occasionally for more violent offenses. In 1991, he was arrested in Kentucky for theft, but nothing tied him to the murders he was committing in other states. In 1994, he was picked up in California for similar petty crimes. Each arrest ended the same way, a short jail term or probation, followed by release. Law enforcement databases were not yet integrated nationwide, so a detective in Los Angeles could not easily see that Sam Little had just been arrested in Ohio or Florida. Each jurisdiction treated him as a local problem, never realizing they were dealing with a nationwide killer. There were moments, however, when the truth nearly surfaced. In 1984, the same year as his San Diego conviction, authorities began to suspect that Sam might be connected to other unsolved murders. But the lack of physical evidence stalled investigations. Forensic science in the 1980s was still developing. DNA testing was in its infancy, and strangulation often left little behind for investigators to work with. Many of Sam's victims were also misclassified as overdoses or accidents, meaning their deaths were not even treated as homicides. Without evidence or official recognition of murder, prosecutors had nothing to pursue. Sam benefited directly from these limitations, continuing his spree in plain sight. Another close call came in the early 1990s in Los Angeles. Sam was questioned about the deaths of several women who matched his victim profile, but he denied involvement, and there was insufficient evidence to hold him. Witnesses who could have testified were often dismissed due to their backgrounds. Many were sex workers or addicts, individuals whom courts at the time viewed as unreliable. Their testimonies, even if accurate, carried little weight against Sam's denials. This repeated failure of the system emboldened him further. He later admitted that he felt untouchable, convinced that the law could never truly stop him. What kept Sam hidden was not only his cunning, but also society's indifference toward his victims. Police departments at the time were overwhelmed, and crimes against marginalized women were not given the same urgency as others. A missing sex worker rarely sparked citywide searches or national headlines. Their deaths, when noticed, were often written off as inevitable consequences of dangerous lifestyles. Sam understood this prejudice and used it to his advantage. He deliberately chose victims whom the world ignored, knowing that their disappearances would not trigger immediate alarm. This cruel calculation allowed him to continue killing even as his name appeared repeatedly in arrest logs. By the mid-1990s, Sam Little had been arrested over 75 times. His record was vast, but fragmented across dozens of jurisdictions. A prosecutor in one state saw him as a thief. Another saw him as a drug offender. A third might have suspected him of violence, but lacked proof. None saw the complete picture, a man who had killed dozens of women, moving freely across the country. The sheer scale of his crimes was hidden by the system's inability to connect the dots. Sam, meanwhile, perfected his routine, targeting vulnerable women, strangling them, and moving on before suspicions could catch up. In 1996, Sam was arrested in Ohio on charges of drug possession. Again, he served only a short time. By this point, his age was beginning to show. He was in his mid-50s, but his strength and predatory instincts remained intact. He continued to kill into the late 1990s, undeterred by age or past arrests. His life was a cycle: arrest, release, drift, kill, repeat. And each cycle reinforced the failure of the justice system to recognize the predator in their midst. By the end of the 1990s, Sam Little's encounters with law enforcement had spanned nearly every corner of the United States. He had been fingerprinted, photographed, and cataloged by police more times than most career criminals ever would. Yet despite this mountain of records, no one had identified him as a serial killer. He was the perfect example of how a man could live in the cracks of the system, visible enough to be noticed, but never seen for what he truly was. It would not be until the 2000s, with the rise of DNA technology and renewed investigations into cold cases, that the truth would begin to emerge. But in the 1980s and 1990s, Sam Little thrived in his role as a drifter criminal, constantly encountering police yet constantly escaping their grasp. His life was proof of how one man could exploit systemic weaknesses to commit an extraordinary number of murders while standing right in front of the authorities all along. By the dawn of the new millennium, Sam Little was already one of the deadliest killers in American history, though no one yet recognized the full scale of his crimes. He was in his 60s now, still drifting, still committing small-time offenses, and still carrying the memories of dozens of murders that remained unsolved. But what Sam didn't know was that the world around him was changing. Advances in DNA technology, combined with the persistence of cold case investigators, were about to shine a light on the darkness he had hidden in for so long. Throughout the early 2000s, law enforcement agencies across the country began revisiting old homicide files. These cold case units were created to re-examine unsolved murders using new forensic methods. DNA testing, once primitive and unreliable, had become more precise. Samples that had sat for decades in evidence lockers were now yielding genetic profiles. Suddenly, cases thought impossible to solve were being reopened, and long-forgotten victims had a new chance at justice. Sam Little's crimes were buried in these archives. The bodies of women he had strangled in the 1980s and 1990s had often been misclassified as overdoses or accidents. But in some instances, investigators had preserved physical evidence. Fingernail scrapings, hair, or traces of DNA from skin contact were stored, waiting for a future where science could reveal their secrets. That future arrived in the 2000s. One of the earliest breakthroughs came from Los Angeles. Detectives revisiting unsolved murders of women from the 1980s began running DNA samples through national databases. In 2012, a match appeared. DNA taken from a murder victim in 1989 matched Sam Little. The revelation was chilling, but also confusing. To the Los Angeles Police Department, Sam was known as a drifter with a long history of arrests, mostly for petty crimes. Now, his DNA tied him to violent murders. Investigators realized they were dealing with something far bigger than they had imagined. At the same time, similar cases were surfacing in other states. DNA from unsolved murders in Florida, Mississippi, and Texas began linking back to the same man. The picture was becoming clear. Sam Little was not just a career petty criminal. He was a serial killer operating on a massive scale. The challenge for investigators now was to find him and gather enough evidence to build a strong case. By 2012, Sam was living quietly in a homeless shelter in Kentucky. Age had slowed him, but his history of drifting and surviving at society's edges remained the same. He was picked up on a drug charge and extradited to California, where the murder charges awaited him. For the first time, Sam faced the possibility of real accountability for the decades of violence he had inflicted. When Los Angeles prosecutors charged him with the murders of 3 women, it seemed like a major breakthrough. The evidence was strong. DNA linked him directly to the victims. In 2014, after a lengthy trial, Sam Little was convicted and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. For investigators, this was a significant victory. But even as Sam sat in prison, questions lingered. Was he responsible for other murders that matched his pattern? The answer, as they would soon learn, was staggering. The real breakthrough came not just from technology, but from persistence. Cold case detectives and FBI analysts and local police began pooling resources to review unsolved murders nationwide. Patterns began to emerge of the method of strangulation, the transient suspect, the victim's profiles. The more they looked, the more they realized that Sam Little's crimes extended far beyond the 3 Los Angeles murders. He had potentially killed dozens, maybe even hundreds of women across the country. In 2018, the FBI launched a nationwide effort to interview Sam and gather confessions. At first, he was reluctant. He had spent his life denying involvement, manipulating the truth, and escaping accountability. But eventually, perhaps due to age, loneliness, or the attention he received from investigators, he began to talk. What followed was one of the most extraordinary series of confessions in American criminal history. Sam Little confessed to killing over 90 women between 1970 and 2005. The number was staggering, almost unbelievable. Investigators were skeptical at first, but then he began providing details, names, locations, dates, clothing, physical features, details that only the killer could know. In some cases, he even drew portraits of his victims from memory decades after their deaths. His ability to recall their faces with such precision astonished investigators and confirmed that his claims were not the fantasies of a man seeking attention. Cold case files across the country began to light up. Police in Texas reopened old homicide records and found that Sam's confessions matched unsolved murders from the 1980s. In Florida, his descriptions aligned perfectly with victims whose cases had been forgotten. In Ohio, Louisiana, and California, detectives were stunned to realize that cases they had struggled with for years were now being explained by the words of an old man in a prison cell. The FBI eventually verified over 60 of his confessions, making him the most prolific serial killer in American history. Yet even with that confirmation, dozens of his claimed murders remain unverified, either due to missing evidence or unidentified victims. Regardless, the scale of his crimes was unprecedented. For decades, he had hidden in plain sight, killing across state lines, targeting the vulnerable, and escaping justice. Now, with the cooperation of multiple agencies, his crimes were finally being acknowledged. The cold cases of the 1980s and 1990s, once dismissed or ignored, were suddenly re-examined in a new light. Families who had lost loved ones decades earlier were contacted, some finally receiving the answers they had been waiting for. For others, the news was bittersweet, confirmation of a death they had suspected, but also the painful knowledge that their loved one had been a victim of one of America's worst killers. Sam Little's confessions transformed the way investigators understood not only his crimes, but also the failures of the justice system. For decades, women had been killed, their cases neglected, their lives dismissed as unworthy of full investigation. The cold case breakthroughs were not just about catching a killer. They were about exposing a society that had allowed him to thrive. By the end of the 2010s, Sam Little was no longer a drifter evading justice. He was an old man confined to a wheelchair, sitting in a prison cell, recounting his past in chilling detail. The confessions he gave, the sketches he drew, and the lives he described finally gave voice to the victims who had been silenced. For investigators, the cold case breakthroughs were not a complete victory. Too many questions remained unanswered, but they were a monumental step toward truth. When Sam Little finally began to talk, it was as if a dam had broken. For decades, he had lived in silence, hiding his darkest truths behind lies, denials, and evasions. But in the late 2010s, inside a Texas prison cell, the truth poured out of him. Confession after confession, detail after detail, murder after murder. It was here, in his final years, that Sam Little revealed himself not only as a serial killer, but as the most prolific murderer in American history. At first, investigators struggled to believe what they were hearing. It wasn't uncommon for killers behind bars to exaggerate their crimes, invent stories, or claim credit for murders they didn't commit. But Sam's words carried an authenticity that quickly erased doubt. He described faces, streets, clothing, jewelry, even the way a woman's hair curled in the night air. These were not the vague ramblings of a man seeking notoriety. These were memories, vivid and precise, locked away for decades and now spilling into the open. Sam had an extraordinary memory for the women he killed. He could recall their smiles, their accents, the way they moved. While he forgot dates, years, or exact times, he never forgot their faces. In fact, he began to draw them, portraits of his victims created from memory using colored pencils in his cell. These sketches became haunting artifacts of his crimes, each one a window into the life of a woman who had been forgotten by the world, but remembered with chilling clarity by her killer. The portraits shocked investigators. They weren't crude or abstract, they were detailed, lifelike, and filled with personality. A woman's eyes shone with intensity, her lips curved in a faint smile, her hairstyle captured with eerie accuracy. For families who had spent years searching for answers, these drawings sometimes became the first clue in identifying a long-lost loved one. Sam's artwork was both grotesque and invaluable. A killer's trophies turned into tools for justice. The FBI took these confessions and sketches seriously. In 2018, the agency launched what it described as the most extensive effort in history to verify a serial killer's claims. Working with state and local police across the country, the FBI began cross-referencing Sam's descriptions with unsolved cases. Investigators reopened files, revisited crime scenes, and re-interviewed witnesses. Slowly, the pieces began to align. Sam described killing a woman in Miami in the early 1980s. Investigators checked old records and found a body discovered in the area that matched his account. He recalled a young woman in Arkansas, her red shoes, and the field where he left her. Detectives found a corresponding case unsolved for decades that mirrored his memory. Again and again, his confessions lined up with reality. The details he provided, specific enough to rule out coincidence, gave law enforcement the confirmation they needed. By 2019, the FBI publicly declared Sam Little the most prolific serial killer in U.S. history. They confirmed at least 60 of his murders, a staggering number that dwarfed the records of infamous killers like Ted Bundy or John Wayne Gacy. And yet, Sam claimed even more, over 90 women. To this day, investigators believe that his total number of victims could be even higher, as many of his confessions remain unverified due to missing records or unidentified bodies. The FBI's website began publishing his portraits and the corresponding details of his confessions. They invited the public to come forward if they recognized a face, hoping to close as many cases as possible. Families across the country looked at the sketches, searching for familiar eyes, noses, or hairstyles. For some, the images provided long-awaited answers. For others, they brought new waves of grief, confirming what they had always feared, that their loved one's disappearance had ended in murder. Sam's confessions also forced law enforcement to confront decades of systemic failure. Many of his victims had been dismissed in life, and forgotten in death. They were women struggling with addiction, poverty, or sex work, individual society too often turned its back on. Their murders were written off as overdoses, accidents, or lifestyle consequences. For years, police departments failed to connect the dots, and families were left in the dark. Now, Sam's words exposed just how many lives had been erased by neglect as much as by violence. What made Sam's confessions especially chilling was his lack of remorse. He didn't express regret for the lives he had taken. Instead, he spoke of them almost matter-of-factly, as though describing a routine. He even took a twisted pride in his memory, telling investigators that he could recall details others would have forgotten. His sketches were not drawn out of guilt, but out of the same compulsive recollection that fueled his confessions. He remembered his victims not because he valued them, but because their deaths were the defining moments of his life. And yet, despite his motives, his confessions brought a measure of closure. They gave names to the nameless, faces to the forgotten, and answers to families who had waited for decades. In many cases, Sam Little's own words were the only evidence that tied him to the murders. But those words were powerful enough to fill the gaps left by years of silence. The FBI's confirmation of 60 murders made headlines worldwide. The scale of his crimes shocked the public and redefined the understanding of serial killing in America. Sam Little wasn't the charismatic predator like Bundy, nor the sadistic monster like Gacy. He was quieter, more methodical, and far more prolific. He operated in the shadows, killing women who lived in society's blind spots, and he succeeded in doing so for nearly half a century. By the end of 2019, Sam was confined to a wheelchair, frail and aging, but still sharp of mind. He continued to speak with investigators, recounting his crimes with unnerving detail. Each new confession opened another case file, another chance for justice, another painful truth for families, for the FBI and for America. These interviews represented both a reckoning with the past and a warning for the future. The system had allowed one man to kill with impunity for decades, and it could happen again if lessons weren't learned. Sam Little's confessions and sketches stand today as a macabre archive of one man's destruction. They are testaments to the women whose lives were stolen, reminders of the justice that was denied for so long, and evidence of the resilience of investigators who refused to let those stories remain untold. In the end, it wasn't just the science of DNA that exposed Sam Little. It was his own need to talk, to unburden himself, and to relive the crimes that had defined his life. And through those confessions, America came to know the face of its most prolific killer, and the faces of the women he tried, but failed to erase. When the cell door closed behind Sam Little in 2014, many believed his story had reached its conclusion. He had been convicted of 3 murders in Los Angeles and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Yet, in reality, prison was not the end of Sam Little's story. It became the stage upon which his darkest truths would finally come to light. At first, Sam was just another aging inmate, one among thousands in California's correctional system. He was in his mid-70s, his health already in decline, and his days marked by the monotony of prison life. But Sam Little was not like other inmates. While many prisoners faded into obscurity, Sam would become the subject of national and international attention, his name etched into history, not because of redemption or reform, but because of the staggering scope of his crimes. Prison stripped Sam of his freedom, but it did not strip him of his memories. In fact, it was inside those walls that he began to open up about his past in ways he never had before. By the late 2010s, law enforcement officials recognized that he was no ordinary killer. The FBI, working with Texas Rangers and other agencies, began conducting regular interviews with him. These sessions became a kind of ritual. Investigators sitting across from an old man in a wheelchair, listening as he recounted murder after murder, city after city, face after face. The conditions of his imprisonment played a role in his willingness to talk. Sam was moved to a Texas prison after his Los Angeles conviction, and it was there that he encountered Ranger James Holland, a skilled interrogator known for his ability to connect with difficult suspects. Holland approached Sam not with accusations, but with patience, curiosity, and a willingness to listen. This approach paid off. For reasons still debated, Sam responded to him. Perhaps it was loneliness, perhaps pride, perhaps a desire for recognition after a lifetime of drifting in obscurity. Whatever the reason, Sam began to share his life's secrets. As the interviews continued, Sam's confessions grew in number and detail. He spoke with an unnerving calmness, often smiling as he recalled the women he had killed. He described their personalities, the moments before their deaths, and even their clothing. For him, the prison cell became a confessional booth, and the investigators his reluctant audience. Unlike many killers, Sam did not embellish or dramatize his crimes. He told them with a matter-of-fact tone, as though describing everyday events. This detached honesty made his words all the more chilling. The media soon caught wind of the scale of his confessions. Headlines declared Sam Little the most prolific serial killer in U.S. history. News outlets around the world reported on his staggering body count. Documentaries and investigative specials began to feature his story, bringing attention not only to his crimes, but also to the failures of the justice system that had allowed him to continue killing for so long. For the public, the revelations were shocking. Sam Little had operated for decades, leaving behind dozens of victims, and yet he had remained virtually unknown until his final years. Inside prison, Sam received a level of attention he had never experienced in his life. For decades, he had lived as a drifter, largely invisible. But now he was at the center of one of the most significant criminal investigations in American history. Some inmates viewed him with curiosity, others with fear. But Sam himself seemed to relish the attention. He enjoyed talking with investigators, sketching portraits of his victims, and recounting stories of his past. In a twisted sense, prison gave him the audience he had always lacked. Despite the notoriety, Sam's health continued to deteriorate. By the late 2010s, he was confined to a wheelchair, suffering from heart problems and diabetes. His body weakened, but his mind remained sharp. He continued to confess murders well into 2020, providing investigators with details that helped close decades-old cold cases. Even as his strength failed, his memory of the women he killed never faltered. It was as if those murders, etched permanently in his mind, sustained him long after everything else faded. For families of the victims, the prison confessions were a mixture of relief and agony. On one hand, they finally had answers. Some families had waited decades to learn what had happened to their loved ones, and Sam's words provided long-sought closure. On the other hand, hearing the cold, emotionless way he described the killings reopened old wounds. Many families struggled with the knowledge that justice had come so late, and that the man responsible had lived most of his life without consequence. In December 2020, Sam Little's life came to an end. He died in a California hospital at the age of 80, still in custody. No official cause of death was released immediately, but it was widely reported that he had been suffering from multiple health problems for years. For some, his death brought a measure of closure, But for others, it was an unsatisfying end. He had escaped justice for decades, and though he eventually spent his final years behind bars, many believed he had still lived far longer and freer than he deserved. Even in death, Sam Little's legacy looms large. The FBI continues to work on verifying his confessions, and as recently as 2021, they were still releasing information about his victims. His drawings remain haunting reminders of the lives he took. Faces preserved not out of love or remorse, but out of the twisted recollections of a killer. For law enforcement, his case stands as both a triumph and a tragedy. A triumph of modern forensic science and persistence, but a tragedy of systemic failures that allowed him to thrive for decades. Sam Little's prison years and eventual death marked the final chapter of his personal story, but the ripple effects of his crimes continue. His confessions reshaped the understanding of serial crime in America, exposed the vulnerabilities of marginalized women, and highlighted the importance of cold case investigations. More than anything, his story serves as a warning: monsters can live among us unnoticed for far longer than we dare to imagine. In the end, prison did not rehabilitate Sam Little, nor did it force him into remorse. Instead, it revealed him fully for what he was, a man who spent a lifetime taking lives, who remembered every detail, and who only in his final years shared those memories with the world. His death closed one chapter, but the scars of his crimes remain, carried by the families of his victims and etched forever into the dark history of American crime. When Sam Little died in 2020, he left behind no fortune, no family legacy, no empire to remember him by. What he left instead was a trail of devastation stretching across decades and across the map of the United States. A trail that would forever change the way America understood serial crime. His legacy is not one of power or respect, but one of failure, a mirror reflecting how justice can overlook the most vulnerable among us, and how one man could take advantage of those blind spots to become the most prolific serial killer in the nation's history. The first and most immediate part of Sam Little's legacy is his staggering body count. The FBI has confirmed over 60 murders tied directly to him, and he claimed responsibility for more than 90. That number places him above infamous names like Ted Bundy, John Wayne Gacy, and Gary Ridgway. But unlike those killers, who became cultural icons of evil almost immediately, Sam remained largely unknown until his final years. His story forces a reckoning with how easily a predator can exist in plain sight when society chooses not to see his victims. And that is the second, and perhaps most important, lesson of his legacy: the invisibility of his victims. Sam Little did not prey on high-profile targets, nor did he seek media attention. His victims were women living at the edges of society, sex workers, women struggling with addiction, women without stable housing or support networks. Many of them were women of color, whose disappearances rarely received the urgency or media coverage that might have been given to others. Sam knew this. He admitted that he chose them because they were less likely to be missed. In those words lies a brutal indictment of the way society valued, or failed to value, certain lives. For decades, the justice system underestimated him. Despite being arrested nearly 100 times across 19 states, he was never recognized as the predator he truly was. Each jurisdiction saw only a piece of him: a thief here, an addict there, a violent man in another place. No one connected the dots until it was far too late. The lesson here is painfully clear. Fragmented law enforcement systems, poor communication across state lines, and the dismissal of marginalized victims created the perfect storm in which Sam Little could operate undetected. The rise of DNA technology eventually cracked open the truth, but the reliance on science alone cannot undo decades of neglect. Sam Little's confessions and the haunting portraits he drew of his victims have become tools not just for solving crimes, but for reminding investigators and the public alike that no life is expendable. His case has already reshaped the way law enforcement approaches cold cases. More resources are now being directed toward revisiting unsolved murders, especially those involving women who were previously dismissed as runaways or drug overdoses. The hope is that no other predator can hide in those blind spots again. Culturally, Sam Little's name does not carry the same notoriety as Bundy or Dahmer, perhaps because his story lacks the sensationalism that often drives public fascination. He was not charismatic, he did not crave the spotlight, and he did not fit the Hollywood image of a serial killer. Instead, he was quiet, methodical, and relentless. His crimes remind us that evil does not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it lurks in the shadows, unnoticed, feeding on the invisible and forgotten. That subtlety makes his legacy even more chilling. For the families of his victims, his legacy is deeply personal. His confessions and drawings gave answers to some, but they also reopened wounds that had never fully healed. Many families had lived for decades with uncertainty, hoping their loved one might still be alive. Learning the truth, even after so many years, was both a gift and a curse. His sketches, while invaluable for identification, are also a grotesque reminder that the last person to remember these women was the man who killed them. That cruel reality is part of the enduring pain left in his wake. Law enforcement, too, has had to reckon with its role in his story. Sam Little was a man who should have been stopped in the 1970s or 1980s when he was first arrested for violent assaults. Instead, short prison terms and a lack of coordination between states gave him freedom to continue killing. His case is now studied in criminology courses and law enforcement training as a case study in systemic failure. The message is clear. Ignoring certain crimes or certain victims can have devastating consequences. In a broader sense, Sam Little's legacy forces society to confront uncomfortable truths. We often measure justice not by how we protect the powerful, but by how we protect the vulnerable. Sam thrived precisely because the vulnerable were not protected. His ability to kill for decades without consequence is not just a story about one man. It is a story about all the institutions, attitudes, and prejudices that failed to stop him. His crimes serve as a reminder that justice is only as strong as its commitment to value every life equally. By the time of his death, Sam Little had spent years recounting his crimes to investigators, sketching his victims, and slowly filling in the blanks of a horrifying puzzle. He did not die in the notoriety of courtroom drama or public spectacle. Instead, he died quietly in a hospital bed, his name cemented in history not as a celebrity killer, but as a grim record holder. The deadliest serial killer America has ever known. But his true legacy lies not in the numbers or even in the horror of his crimes. His legacy lies in the faces he tried to erase, but ended up immortalizing through his confessions and drawings. His story is not just about the darkness of one man, but about the need to shine light into the places where society often refuses to look. Sam Little's life is a dark mark on American justice. It is the story of a man who should have been stopped, but wasn't. The story of women who should have been protected, but weren't. And the story of a justice system that must learn from its failures so that no one like him can ever slip through again.